Hey. Good evening, everyone. It is such a pleasure to share the stage with such wonderful, thoughtful individuals, many of which I've spent time reading and getting to know through YouTube and other methods. But I would like to go ahead and introduce our esteemed panel. And I will start with Richard Davidson. Richard Davidson is founder and director of the Center for Healthy Minds at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He is best known for his groundbreaking work studying emotion and the brain. He received his PhD from Harvard University in psychology, psychopathology, and psychophysiology with a minor focus in behavioral neurology and neuroanatomy, and a BS in psychology from New York University. A friend and colleague of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, he is a highly sought-after expert and speaker, leading conversations on well-being in international stages such as the World Economic Forum, where he serves on the Global Council on Mental Health. In 2006, Time magazine included him as one of the 100 most influential people in the world. His research is broadly focused on the neural bases of emotion and emotional style and methods to promote human flourishing, including meditation and related contemplative practices. Dr. Davidson, I'd like to invite you to maybe just share a few opening thoughts with us.
Thank you so much, Rashad, and thank you all. Thank you, Owsley, for putting on this amazing festival, and Sarah, and all of the other volunteers who make this possible. It's really a very special gathering. And I'm so honored to be on the same stage with you, Mary Evelyn, to share this space. I'm a neuroscientist by training, and one of the central insights from modern neuroscience is that our brains are plastic. And what we mean by that is that experience can get under the skin and shape our brains. It also invites the possibility that we can actually train our brains for the promotion of human flourishing. These mechanisms of plasticity are neutral with respect to whether they're good or bad. If there is adversity happening, if trauma is happening, it will get under the skin, it will scar our brain. And there's been a lot of scarring over the last number of years in particular. Of particular relevance to this audience, Kentucky is one of 28 states in the United States that saw more than a 10% increase in the use of prescription psychiatric drugs over the last 3 years. 29% of adults in Kentucky today are taking psychiatric drugs, and that's been a 13% increase since January of 2021. I'm not someone who's anti-medication, but this is simply a data point to underscore the magnitude of the problem, which is that our well-being is in serious decline. And the components that comprise our well-being are the kind of components that are leading us to some of the most devastating problems that we face today, including decisions that have been made about our planet and climate change, decisions that are embedded in the systemic racism that we are confronting in our nation, and decisions and consequences with states of depression and loneliness that are increasing with such magnitude. In a poll that was taken just before COVID, 76% of Americans reported being either moderately or significantly lonely. And loneliness is more than twofold the risk factor than obesity for mortality. And this underscores how these constructs get under the skin. One of the messages that I wish to share with you this evening is something that has been repeatedly offered by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. We were just with him in India just about 10 days ago for a series of events. First time I've seen him in person since COVID, and it was really such a privilege and so nourishing to be with him. And he reminds us that every human being is basically the same, and that we all have the wherewithal, we all have the capacity to flourish. And I'd like to put it in more specific ways and share with you a little of the science around it. We actually are all born to be kind. And we're all born to flourish. This is part of our nature. Some of you may be surprised to say that we're all, with the statement that we're all born to be kind. And let me just give you one little tidbit of evidence. In research that's been done with young infants, 6-month-old infants, if you expose these infants to puppets that are playing together, and in one case, the puppets are warm-hearted and are kind to each other, and in another case, the puppets are selfish and aggressive, guess which the infants prefer to look at? I'm sure that all of you are guessing correctly. The infants prefer the kind puppets, but they don't, it's not like 55% to 45%. And I actually just went back to this original paper, which was published in one of the most prestigious scientific journals in the world, to actually check the statistics. 100% of 6-month-old infants showed this preference. 100%. So we're born to show this preference. And when we engage in practices to cultivate qualities like kindness, we're not creating something de novo, but rather we're reminding ourselves of our basic nature. And this is something so incredibly important, and really something that we believe is critical in helping us to shift the narrative. We are exposed on a daily basis to messages of fear in the media. And our Surgeon General in the United States, who I've gotten to know over the last several years, really an amazing person by the name of Vivek Murthy, has framed this as an epic struggle between the forces of fear and the forces of love. Fear, we know from modern neuroscience, actually constricts the aperture of our awareness. It literally does that so that we become less attentive to other qualities of a human being. And we focus on simply those that are potentially triggers of threat. And this is the paradigm that many people in our country are now living in, and it is one that is pernicious and has effects not just on our mind, but also on our body. So one of the great insights from modern science is that the same mechanisms that encode trauma, the same mechanisms that are responsible for suffering, are responsible for the health inequities that we see. These are mechanisms of plasticity. These mechanisms can be harnessed for the good. When human beings first evolved on this planet, none of us were brushing our teeth. And yet, I'm sure every one of you brushes your teeth. In fact, virtually every human being on the planet now brushes their teeth. This is not part of our genome. This is something that we've all collectively figured out how to do. And I think most people would agree that their minds are even more important than their teeth. And if we spent even as short a time as we spend each day brushing our teeth, nourishing our mind and our heart, this world would be a different place. So one of the things that we are focused on these days is disseminating strategies to cultivate human flourishing, human well-being. And we're really excited to bring this to a number of different sectors, and one of them that we've spent a lot of time with, particularly over the last 10 years, is education. Our educators in this country are really suffering, and when they suffer, our children suffer. And so if we can bring strategies, simple strategies, to help educators and those who work on behalf of our children in school systems, if we help them to become more well, to flourish, we will have trickle-down effects on our students. And we have actually launched, thank you, we've launched a project here in Louisville that started just this month. And we will be working with more than 1,000 personnel in the Jefferson County public school system. And if we can have the one slide so if any of you either work for the Jefferson County public school system, or if you know somebody who works for the Jefferson County public school system, please refer them to this work, because all of the employees, not just teachers, office staff, administrators, principals, kitchen staff, bus drivers, everyone is welcome and encouraged to participate. And this is a little blurb about it. And we are bringing strategies to cultivate well-being through a simple program that we've developed that's been put in the form of an app, which any of you can freely download, called the Healthy Minds Program. And one of the things that we found in work that we've already done is that when teachers receive this, there are two specific findings that we've reported on that have just been published in the scientific literature that I'd like to share, and I'll end with this. One is that when we taught this program to teachers just before COVID and followed them during COVID in a randomized controlled trial, it turns out that these teachers are 6 times more likely to still be teaching today than their randomly assigned counterparts. 6 times more likely to still be teaching. And when we did a cost-benefit analysis, for every dollar invested in a program to train well-being, there was a $3.34 return on that investment in 3 years. Pretty good return. The second finding is one that is really at the core of this pernicious achievement gap, a so-called achievement gap in academic achievement between African American and white students in America today. Research shows that one of the most significant drivers of this achievement gap is what education researchers call a disciplinary gap. And the disciplinary gap is the disproportionate administration of harsh and punitive punishment toward members of racial outgroups. And even this is being done by teachers who on a questionnaire will say that they have absolutely no bias. Yet when we test them with more sensitive measures of unconscious or implicit bias, they show that, and we all show that. And it turns out that simple strategies to cultivate particularly the aspect of well-being that is associated with this element that we call connection, And connection includes qualities like appreciation and gratitude, kindness and compassion. It turns out that this reduces our measures of implicit bias, and this endures for up to 6 months, which is what we've shown in our research. So let me end by saying that the scientific research is really consistent with a very different narrative about human beings. We are kind by nature. We are born to flourish. And with a simple shift in mindset, there's a lot that we can do to change this world. So thank you all very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that, Richie. And I'm hoping that we can return to this idea of being hardwired for kindness. I think that's really compelling. I also want to invite Mary Evelyn. I want to invite Daniel. Just any responses that you may have to what Richie shared for us.
Yeah, I have a question for Richie. I love the finding on appreciation and gratitude in schools among kids. Is there a way to extend that? You said it lasted for 6 months. Could it be embedded as an ongoing practice, do you think, in schools?
I do think so. And, you know, we've only tested it as of now up to 6 months. So it may indeed endure for longer than 6 months. We just haven't tested it. One of the aspirations that we have is that the program that we're bringing to Louisville is available for at no cost in an app that we've freely released. And so we would encourage people to explore it, and it will be around after the research project itself has ended, after the formal project, and it will be supported and updated. And we have a version that we're bringing to Louisville that's quite specific to educators. And so we will do everything we can to reduce the barriers so that it really becomes a part of the culture in the schools.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Did you want to add anything, Mary Evelyn? Or?
Well, I think it's fantastic research, and I think the fact that it's coming out of an educational setting has a lot to do with what Richie's done for a long time. So this is just a big shout out to say that even doing research along these lines and doing research on meditation is very forward thinking, especially now in its application for education. So I thank you for that. It's not easy to do in academia.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I would like to do another introduction for one of our panelists, and I'll go to you, Mary Evelyn Tucker. Mary Evelyn Tucker teaches at Yale University's School of Environment and at the Divinity School. She is co-director with John Grimm of the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology and has co-organized 10 conferences on world religions and ecology. Mary Evelyn is the author and editor of close to 20 volumes and has published hundreds of articles. She is widely regarded as a pioneer in the field of religion and ecology. Mary Evelyn was a member of the Earth Charter Drafting Committee and the International Earth Charter Council. She won the Inspiring Yale Teaching Award in 2015 and has been awarded 5 honorary degrees. With Grimm, she received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the International Society for the Study of Religion, Nature, and Culture. And Mary Evelyn, I invite you to share some opening thoughts with us as well.
Well, thank you. It's really a pleasure to be with you all. And of course, a big shout out to the Brown family, Christy Brown and Owsley, and your persistence over 26 years. It's amazing. And Sarah and Juniper and staff who are so dedicated to all of this. And very much gratitude as well to Jim and Marianne Welch for their hospitality, and my dear husband, who I woke up this morning. He's caring for everything, needless to say, with these broken wrists. But he said, I had a dream. I had a dream. And to wake up in a friend's house and have a dream is a very special thing. And he told me this dream that was so elaborate and so vivid. And I feel I'm the luckiest person alive who can have a dreamer right next to me through my whole journey. So let's give it up for John Grimm, can we? Because this is about dreams, isn't it? And it's about the sense, like Carl Jung wrote his book, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. And I come here and I'm nourished by Louisville. I'm nourished by Kentucky. Because as Marianne said this morning at breakfast, this is a place that is riveted, that is webbed with story. And that's clear in the music here, in the way people interact. As Jim said, even in business, you tell a story, so you make your point, and so on. I love that sensibility. And so stories are the basis of culture all over the world. There's no question. When I was a child, my father would read all the Grimm fairy tales to us, but he read right up through Dickens and so on, Oliver Twist, and we were just enchanted listening to those stories. There's nothing like listening to a story. And if I meet one of you tonight, I'm sure I'd be like, where are you from? Tell me your story. And it was wonderful to have our old friend Matt Fox here this afternoon telling his story, because we've had a journey with him, with Thomas Berry and Brian Swim, and a Journey of the Universe film and project that we've done. And I want to come back to my origin story to say why this festival matters so much. My grandfather taught history at Columbia, and he was a founder of National Conference of Christian Jews with 4 others. And this sense of interreligious dialogue is part of our DNA and part of that whole Columbia area for decades. But as well, when I went to college in Washington, D.C., in the late 60s, where Nancy Pelosi went as well, I was passionate to go there because of civil rights. And I didn't want to go to a northern eastern women's college and so on. But the civil rights movement, the anti-Vietnam movement that Richie and were all part of that era made such a difference. And I want to say why we got involved in telling the stories of world religions through the lens of the environment was because in those days, we had this notion, separate but equal, everything's going to be fine, educational systems, restaurants, bathrooms, swimming pools, separate but equal, fine. When the religious leaders got on board and said that wasn't fine, and Martin Luther King and the rhetoric and the power and John Lewis and Rosa Parks, and we can go on, that moral force changed the face of this country. And it is still obviously deeply needed, but it's the moral force that's needed for our environment as well. Because if we don't bring that to bear, we're not going to make it through this hourglass of extinction that we're living through, of pollution, of climate change. These are the 3 huge problems that the UN has identified for the environment. But let me back up and say, we need new stories, as this whole conference is dealing with. Thomas Berry said this in 1978. He said, we need a new story of evolution, which I'll come back to in a minute. But the way I see it now, we need a new story in education. Again, Matt Fox has been doing that forever. We need a new story of economics. We need a new political story. We need a new ecological story and an evolutionary story. Now, that's a lot. But if we come back to where should we begin in this country, in this city, in this amazing state, our basic dream that has driven America for so long is the American dream. The American dream. This is why people come here, right? But it has become distorted to say more and more materialism, things, stuff. That's what the American dream has degenerated into. So it's a distorted, maladaptive dream that we need to rethink. And the other huge dream that has also unfortunately become distorted, that is the Enlightenment period in Europe. Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, fantastic. It goes into our Declaration of Independence. We celebrate July 4th. Life, is it only about humans? Is it not about all these incredible ecosystems, the Ohio River, the amazing species, the birds in this area, the trees, the forests? Life is an interdependent, dynamic system. We've got to spread that notion of what is life, what are we dedicating ourselves to? Liberty. Liberty. Fantastic idea of the Enlightenment period and overthrowing regimes in Europe of totalitarianism and so on, which we're still facing. But when liberty becomes freedom of the individual for the individual with no sense of a common good, with no sense of a larger purpose, and especially with no sense of equity, that is a distortion. And our liberty needs to be rethought for a common good, for common goal, for social equity, and for identifying a dream which is poisonous, like white supremacy. A poisonous dream of hyper-individualism that goes in that direction. And finally, the pursuit of happiness, what does that mean? We are the most addicted society on the planet. We are the most alienated. Our students at Yale and elsewhere are suffering from eco-anxiety, climate grief. They cannot attend to the mental health issues of our next generation, which breaks my heart. I am sleepless about the state of our society, our world, our planet. I know we all are. And when, again, Matt said, we are all grieving. We are grieving. So let me just say in a conclusion, I want to say that grieving will have new life. That sadness will have new joy. That sense of dismemberment will have empowerment. And that is what we're seeing in a city like Louisville, who's gone through, after the Taylor death and so much before that, is going through one of the most astonishing renewals against great odds. That's why I'm here. That's why I'm here, to learn what that means of civic society trying to renew itself, have honest conversations. But it is going to take a new paradigm for education, not locked in silos where science reigns, facts, no values, science, no spirituality, and so on. I've been in secular academia for 50 years in some of the great universities in this country, including Columbia, Princeton, Berkeley, and Harvard. And I can tell you that split, as we were speaking about earlier, that split is one of the most deleterious aspects of health, of human health, of well-being, of ecosystem health. We've got to weave this back together, because that moral energy for change is what we need. A new economic system, a new story of progress, economic progress with no limits, that is a maladapted story. We are now changing to circular economics, ecological economics. Herman Daly just died last week, one of the great economists talking about a steady state economy. We have got to rethink this overshoot that we're in with a new economic sensibility. Brown-Forman, as Jim was saying, is thinking about what's the water, what's the oak, what are the systems that are going into this company, but also what is the ecological footprint, and so on. So companies are doing this, and a big shout out has to be made in that regard. And finally, ecology is not just about measuring ecosystem services for the human. What does a forest give to a human? What does a river give to a human? What species are useful for humans? We have got to return to the origins of ecology, which is in holism, which is in a sense of the intrinsic value of nature. Beauty will guide us. That is the point of the extraordinary dimensions of ecology as holism. And finally, I hope you'll have a chance at some point to see this Journey of the Universe film that came out of thousands of scientists weighing in on how we tell our story in a way that it's not just a random, purposeless universe in which we dwell and have our beings and raise our family and have our struggles. This is the largest story that we can have our being for change within. Carl Anthony, one of the great African-American leaders in the Bay Area, said this story made such a difference in his life because it's something that can bring us together as people for a planet that will flourish in communities despite the odds in which we are dealing. So I invite us to rethink the paradigms of education, of economy, of ecology, and of evolution itself in these new stories. Thank you so much. Thank you for your work.
I'm really hopeful that we can talk some about these narratives. I mean, the narrative of the American dream, I think, is such a complex and nuanced narrative in and of itself. What does it mean to describe the American dream in the shadow of colonialism, the extinction of the native and the indigenous peoples, the use of black slave labor? What is capitalism without anti-black racism and without the ways in which the United States, in such a very unique way, utilized chattel slavery to build economic wealth and capital? And so I'm just really, I think all of these narratives are interconnected. And I also wonder in what ways it speaks to inevitability. But I would really like to hear some responses. Richie, Daniel, just kind of as you hear Mary Evelyn, what's coming to mind for you?
I have a question for Mary Evelyn. I love what you said, and I really want to believe it. But I'm wondering, how do you get a story to stick? How do you spread it? How does it become dominant? And does it lead to action? Do you have an example?
Well, I'm going to speak about our project, Journey of the Universe, which took 10 years, involved many disciplines and so on. It was on PBS for 3 years. It's on Amazon now. We've showed it in many parts of the world. 77,000 people watched it in China in our last event before COVID. But we also did a series of interviews with scientists who are telling this story so that we understand the awe, wonder, and beauty. My point here is awe, wonder, and beauty can drive the action, because the other 10 interviews are with African Americans saying why this has made a difference, Native Americans saying why it's made a difference, John's specialty is Native American studies, people in the arts and so on, why it's made a difference. I had Devin, who's right here, working at the bookstore, saying how this has inspired him as a young person. We have students all the time saying, this has saved me from despair, from addiction, and so on, that we belong to something larger. I'm not saying it's perfect. I think your question is absolutely essential. But we like to think of eco-spirituality, awe, wonder, beauty, leading to eco-justice. And that is something that seems to have resonance for people. Because if we're only talking about awe and wonder and beauty, it can be disconnected from the problems. But sometimes when we're talking about the problems, people get so disempowered and so almost in despair, as we know. So we need this weaving of something that's inspiring. It's why the work of meditation and emotional intelligence is absolutely critical to our time.
Well,
Thank you.
First, I love also what you're saying. You should be our next president, Mary Ellen. And I also particularly appreciate what you're saying about awe and wonder and beauty. These are qualities that are accessible to every human being. And they help to put us into a place that psychologists have called self-transcendent, where we go beyond ourselves. And in order for us to focus on the greater good, and to decrease the pernicious influence of individualism and excessive focus on the self, we really will benefit from opportunities to experience awe and wonder and beauty. This is, by the way, why being in nature is actually deeply beneficial for the human brain and body. And it actually doesn't take much. 10 minutes of being in nature completely changes the default mode of your brain. And this is based on modern neuroscientific evidence. And it's this elicitation of these qualities of awe and wonder and beauty. There is one other thing that I'd like to say, and it's, I think relevant to Dan's question, and that is one of the insights that we glean from modern neuroscience is this distinction between two fundamentally different kinds of learning. One is declarative learning, which is conceptual. It's learning about things. The other we call procedural learning. Procedural learning is acquired through practice. It's skill-based. And we know that it's instantiated in totally different brain systems than declarative learning. And just to give one example, which will make it obvious, you can learn the value of honesty, but we all know that will not necessarily make you a more honest person. You can learn the value of interdependence, but it will not necessarily have you embody that quality so that your behavior will actually change. The academy in this country privileges declarative learning almost to the point of exclusion of procedural learning. That needs to change.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, that was great. And I just want to say, again, Journey of the Universe is one way of telling our evolutionary story. It hasn't been told yet. It's going to be told through lots of lenses in the arts. There's an oratorio already. There's lots of music already around this. There's poems and dance and so on. But I want to just say an example of this embodied learning. Belvie Rooks took a project into Watts after an explosion in that area, and she did a project called From the Streets to the Stars, having inner city children tell their story of the migrations from the South up to LA and so on. All summer long, they told these stories. They worked on it. IBM donated the material, the technology. And at the end of the summer, they had this incredible celebration where their families came together, the family pictures. From the streets to the stars, they oriented themselves to something large. And one other example of that, Barbara Holmes has a book called Race and Cosmos. And she tells a story of young children in, I believe it's in Nashville, and they were taken up to the telescope to look at the stars at night. And one young middle school child turns to his teacher and he says, "This is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. And when I wake up in the car where my family lives without a home, I will always remember this because it will be a source of inspiration." You see, we don't know what's going to inspire hope and possibility. So I just offer those examples of the embodied learning.
Thank you so much. And last but certainly not least, I'd like to introduce Daniel Goleman. Daniel Goleman, a psychologist and science journalist, was with the New York Times for 12 years. He is best known for his book, Emotional Intelligence, which was recently published for its 25th anniversary. Goleman first met the Dalai Lama in the 1980s and organized a series of meetings with His Holiness and scientists, largely through the Mind and Life Institute. Goleman's book, Destructive Emotions, narrates one of those meetings. He was asked to write a force for good about the Dalai Lama's vision for the world to honor His Holiness's 80th birthday. Goleman is co-founder of the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. Its mission centers on bringing evidence-based programs in emotional literacy to schools. With Richard Davidson, Goleman wrote Altered Traits, Science Reveals How Meditation Changes Your Body, Mind, and Brain, a review of the best studies of meditation. His book, Why We Meditate, written with, Saucony Rinpoche? Rinpoche,
You're good.
is forthcoming. Dr. Goldman, I'd like to invite you to share some opening thoughts and comments.
Sure. I want to join Mary Evelyn and Richie in thanking everyone who's organized this panel, the Festival of Faith. I want to also particularly name Owsley Brown, who tried to get me to come to the Festival of Faith for years and years. I'm actually not here in person, but I am at Lamont Doherty, which is the environmental research campus of Columbia University, which happens to be next door to my house. So I'm happy I was able finally to join at least this way. I want to start by naming some legacy dilemmas that we need to face. One is the fact, the often ignored fact that the land that we populate in America was actually stolen from Native Americans, from Indians. And the other big dark secret of American history, of course, is slavery, which the economy was built on. And I recently saw a review of a book that tracks the way in which slave patrols, that is, armed groups that look for runaway slaves, became police forces in this country. So you wonder, why do we have such widespread racial bias? Why is white supremacy found in so many different minds in so many different places? And I think it's because it's part of the legacy of not the American dream, maybe the American nightmare, but it's still a reality. And the question is, if it's part of the normal narrative of so many people today, what could we do to reverse it? And something that Mary Evelyn said makes me think of an analog I'd like to go into. One book, Rashad, you didn't mention that I wrote is called Ecological Intelligence, and it's my look at ecology and the environmental crisis. And one of the things I found was that everything we use and buy, every material good, no matter how virtuous we want to be, has a negative footprint environmentally. And this footprint is in many, sometimes all of the 8 major systems that support life on the planet that range from, the CO2, which we hear a lot about, to biodiversity, drinkable water, you name it. And Mary Evelyn really alluded to all of them. So the American dream, as she said, has devolved into stuff, accumulating stuff. And all of that stuff harms the environment. Interestingly, Mary Evelyn mentioned companies that are doing something about it. Actually, companies could do much, much more because there is a methodology. It's called life cycle assessment. There's a discipline, industrial ecology, that deploys this. Most people in that discipline are hired by companies to assess the impacts of their products, and the findings are kept proprietary. But what if they were open source? What if we all knew them? What if we knew the actual impacts of something we were about to buy at the point we were about to purchase it? This could change the way we made decisions, particularly in the younger generation. I'm thinking of my granddaughter, the Gen Z, as Mary Evelyn said, Gen Z is really full of eco-anxiety. So if we were able to make the actual impacts transparent, I think that younger people particularly would make buying decisions accordingly. So I bring that up as an analog because I think the blind spots that we all share about the actual impacts of the things we buy and use are quite analogous to the blind spots that we find everywhere when it comes to racial bias, to bias of all kinds. And I think that the solutions have to do with surfacing what those biases are, making them transparent, and then modeling the idea, telling a new story that it's not really that great. So let me get back to systemic racism. You know, in recent years, hate speech has spread like a virus, and it's spread through social media, it's spread through modeling. The question is, and this is just taking a note from Mary Evelyn, could we do the same with love speech? Could we have an antithetical point of view, a different story, a different narrative that really talked about the kindness that Richie mentioned and really tried to further that kindness? I think that one of the ways to do this has to do with educational programs, which both Mary Evelyn and Richie have alluded to. Rashad, you mentioned that I have been an advocate of teaching social and emotional competencies to kids in schools. Actually, those programs have pretty much gone viral. They're found in many, many schools around the world, not just in this country. I think that what they lack and what maybe we can add is the importance of kindness and a sense of belonging. Richie, when you and I were graduate students at Harvard, there was a social psychologist named Tom Pettigrew. He had done a study of what was then the war in Serbia and Croatia, where he found that people from those countries who did not harbor bias against the enemy, the so-called enemy, had one thing in common, and that was that they had childhood friends from the other group. And can we use that? Can we mobilize that? Can we use the fact that, for example, Vanessa Dreskat at the University of New Hampshire finds that the top performing teams in companies and organizations all have a very strong sense of belonging. That is, the people who are part of those teams feel at home there. And can we extend that belonging to kids in school, to our neighbors? I'm not optimistic about our ability to change the narrative of people who already have a bias cemented. I think the hope is in future generations. It's in our kids. And it will take longer, but I think it might be more pervasive to change the story with them, to change the experience with them, to go from, to get them to have that procedural understanding of how not to be biased, but to create a sense of kindness and belonging. And let me just close with something the Dalai Lama often says. He says, there are 7 to 8 billion people on this planet, and we're all the same, but we need to learn to live together well. I think that's the lesson, that's the story we want to tell. Thank you.
Richie, Mary Ellen, would you like to chime in and share some thoughts?
Well, I just want to pick up, Dan, thanks for your comments and the fact that your comment about businesses got a strong response. I think that's absolutely right. And we can go on about B Corps that are rated this way and so on. And I do think, and also investment, finance, the fossil fuel divestment program is now at $40 trillion, a third of which is from religious communities. So, finance is changing under pressure, for sure. My brother's head of Chubb Insurance in New York, and he is terribly concerned about climate change, as all the insurance companies are. They need to be brought to the table, you see. But I do think our businesses with leaders within and the next generation, our students aren't going to work for people who are destroying the planet or law firms that are doing the same thing. So I fully agree with that. But we should be even more conscious of what is happening within business, of entrepreneurship, social Patagonia. We can name so many of these groups that are giving us hope for change. So I thank you for that point. And of course, open source and disclosure is really an important part of it. So it can't just be greenwashing. We're doing all this goodness. It's got to be pushed to transparency.
And Mary Evelyn, let me just underscore, I think that we have very auspicious beginnings here and there. If you look at the totality of the world of business and commerce, it's actually a small minority, I'm sad to say. And I'd love to see this transparency about eco-impacts become a universal. And I think it may be driven by younger generations. Gen Z, as you say, is full of eco-anxiety. One way to allay that anxiety is to say, you know, this widget is better than that widget for the planet, and you can buy this widget, the better one, because that's going to create a market force that will make people chase that market share without having to change the reality of the priorities and values of people in business. The fact is that if you want to have talent among young people, as you just pointed out, if you want to have market share, you've got to do the right thing for the planet.
Absolutely. I just want to give a shout out to this book on donut economics. And she is doing such great work in Europe, based in Oxford, Karen Rothorn, I forget her last name, but cities in Europe are doing this, Amsterdam, Copenhagen, and et cetera, new indices of what is appropriate progress or economic health and well-being for these cities, and not overshoot, and what do we do with our waste and so on. So accountability and responsibility within new economic systems.
Yeah, there are actually, just on that note, there are a group of nations, developed nations now, that are part of a group, I believe it's 7 or 8, and growing, that call themselves well-being economies.
Yes.
And interestingly, 4 out of the original 7 are led by women, including New Zealand, Iceland, Finland. Those are 3 of them. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I want to get back to one point that Dan made, which I think is really important about Dan's increased optimism about changing the narrative in the next generation, which I very much agree with. And just wanted to point out 2 things. One is that we know that there's increased plasticity in the brain at this age. It's undergoing more change, and these are sensitive periods in development that's the term we use. Sensitive periods in development where the narrative can be more easily changed based upon the state of the brain. And so this is a real opportunity and invitation. And the other point is that it doesn't actually take that much. There's a study that was published just a couple of years ago with kids in the United States, teenagers, who were African-American teenagers from low-income families in the Northeast, where they were asked to write about values that went beyond themselves. For example, their family, their community. And they did this simple writing exercise for 4 times over the course of 1 year, for 10 minutes each time. So it's a total of 40 minutes over the course of 1 year. Those kids were significantly more likely 7 years later to graduate from a 4-year college. So it doesn't actually take much to activate a very different narrative. And we need to deploy those strategies in our educational systems, and it's really quite urgent.
You know, Mary Evelyn, when you talk about B Corps, and it really triggered for me thinking about this proliferation of ESGs, ESG index funds, and frankly, it's like, you're just copy and pasting the S&P 500, and everybody's in ESG, right? And so there really is sort of this watering out effect of what it actually means to do business with a sense of what is good for the environment, what is good for communities, what is good socially. Mm-hmm. And that really does require some attention and some intentionality.
Yes.
And I'm really interested in how we get to some of the granularity and, just generally speaking around some of those questions. But Daniel, you lifted up this idea of what if we could see the impact of our consumption. And it makes me think of sort of when you go to a McDonald's or Burger King, you can see the calories on the menu, right? And so is there an analog there? Is it apples to apples or perhaps Big Macs to Big Macs? As we think about those comparisons, But what kind of difference or what kind of relationships exist there? So, all of that is really, I think, interesting as we think about how those different processes can have different outcomes.
Mary Evelyn, could I speak to the hamburger question?
Yeah, sure.
You
I'm a
know, it's nice to
vegetarian,
know
but
the
you can speak
calories.
to it.
It's good to know the calories in a Big Mac, but how many acres of the Amazon were cleared in order to raise the cattle that supplied the beef for your hamburger? That's the kind of thing I'm looking at. It means going back deep into the supply chain to look at what was extracted or what was done to the planet in order for us to have this hamburger, whatever it may be.
Yeah. No, there's no question. I think, and see, this is where I think we have to think more holistically, more integratively. The Europeans have been using this word, the polycrisis. Our School of the Environment, 125 years old, created many leaders. They're deeply interested in food issues. They're deeply interested in health, like you're working on at Louisville and so on. But they're finally, and I think this is a post-George Floyd moment, that the School of the Environment is finally getting human issues and diversity. Because by and large, the environmental movement has been about land, not always people, except for certain organizations. But what I'm trying to say is both the movement, TNC, Nature Conservancy, and all these groups, Trust for Public Land, of course, they're saying this has to be together. Our divinity schools have been a little bit more about social justice than the environment. The students are pressing. These are not separate issues. So that's part of the energy and the spirit. And I really want to give a shout out to this next generation, because they do have eco-anxiety, but they're not giving up hope. And I like to say, let's give them an intergenerational handshake, to do this work. And it seems to inspire. We're not abandoning them, we're encouraging them in their creativity, I think.
And I'll just say, too, I appreciate that part of what we're contextualizing, too, is the way some of these harmful narratives have generated, in particular, racialized white supremacist outcomes. And it's worth us noting that these processes of narrative are not new.
Yeah.
We know that the Daughters of the Confederacy were instrumental in making sure that libraries and schools had the lost cause and materials of that nature. So there are these ways in which narrative has been weaponized for the purposes of maintaining where we are. Daniel, you talked about the slave patrols being the evolution of modern day policing. So when we talk about the murders of Breonna Taylor here in Louisville by LMPD and the murders of George Floyd, in what ways have we allowed these unchecked white supremacist processes shape narrative and therefore allow and guarantee in some respects these kinds of outcomes?
I just have to jump in, sorry. I mean, my husband, as I said, is a historian and student of Native traditions. If we knew as much as he knew about the travesty of the treatment of indigenous peoples, that still goes on. We've been adopted into a family on the Crow tribe. We've been on many reservations. These are third world countries. It's incredible. But as well, the history of slavery. It's incredible that we have, here's the issue. We haven't told our history. And we're just finally telling it, and now it's controversial to tell our history? Please. So it's a beginning. It's going to be contested, surprisingly. But that contestation is going to push us forward to tell it better and better. And I may be critical of academia and its elitisms and so on at places like Yale, but people are pressing so hard on colonialism, on inclusivity, and telling the histories right, and they are publishing out the yin-yang to tell this correctly and insist that they support. Our teachers, K through 12, need support in this, right? That's where we can put our energy back into the educational system. Tell our history, tell our story.
Yes. So I think we're taking a small break. Is that right? A little one? Okay. Okay.
I am willing to change. I am willing to see. I am ready to trust in you, in me. I am ready for change. There's a voice and it is mine. There's a vision and it is time. There is courage. The choice is here to live in love and not in fear. I am willing to change. I am willing to see. I am ready to trust in you, in me. I am ready for change. There'll be pushback, and some will say, keep on doing things the same old way. But together, with hope and heart, we'll keep on changing, each doing our part. I am willing to change. I am willing to see. I am ready to trust in you, in me. I am ready for change. I am willing to change. I am willing to see. I am ready to trust in you, in me. I am ready for change. I am ready for change. I am ready for change. I am ready for change.
Thanks, Evelyn.
And we're back. So, we were having a conversation, and each of you have really elevated some of the ways that you're thinking about education, educators, school settings, and the ways that we can engage students and instructors and staff in meaningful ways. I'm curious, as we think about some of the challenges there, whether it's funding for schools, teacher pensions, general investments in education, and as you mentioned, there is now this rabid straw man argument happening at state legislature levels as it relates to critical race theory. Some state legislatures are banning the use of social emotional learning terms in their school systems. And so you think about these practical daily challenges, these legislative policy challenges that are affecting education. I'm wondering, how can we also utilize counter-narratives to support educators who are making difficult decisions about telling the truth in their classrooms? And anyone who'd like to start with that can please feel free.
Well,
Ricardo, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
yeah, why don't you start?
Why don't you start?
Fair enough. So what's interesting to me as we think about, let's take the attacks on critical race theory in particular, what we know is that this isn't something that kids are learning in K through 12. This is an opportunistic method to really sort of shape narrative, to shape the kind of beliefs that parents have in terms of what's happening in the classroom, what level of indoctrination may or may not be taking place. A part of that also is the degree to which schools have some level of independence, autonomy, and support around, to the point that, Mary Evelyn, that you made, to teach an accurate history of our country in a way that positions young people to make different decisions. And so but for me, right, there's a very real struggle for instructors, for teachers who are saying, I want to do the right thing, but I'm afraid of losing my job. I'm afraid of some of the pushback. I'm afraid of some of the very real consequences that can occur if I do so. And in a state like Kentucky, where we're already going in that direction towards critical race theory, I think it certainly puts educators in a tough spot. So if we're going to be in a position to influence the policy decisions that are creating these barriers and to shift those towards creating opportunities, there's got to be a generative narrative process in place. And so to push back to you all, the question is, what can or should that generative narrative process look like? And what recommendations do you have for a state like Kentucky?
Well, just to say a few things relevant to this. The language that we choose, the language that we use to talk about what we do with educators, I think needs to be very carefully crafted and carefully chosen. I think most educators, legislators, and parents would agree that they want their children to be happy. They want their children to be successful. They want their children to lead meaningful lives. They want their children to be good at regulating their emotions. There are ways, I think, that we can frame at least some of this in language that is really going to be part of a different narrative. And one of the things that I want to underscore is that one of the great failures, I think, of modern education is that we do not educate attention in our children. William James in 1890 published a 2-volume tome called The Principles of Psychology, and he has a whole chapter on attention in this book. And he said, the faculty of voluntarily bringing back a wandering attention over and over again is the very root of judgment, character, and will. And he went on to say that an education which should improve this faculty would be the education par excellence. The fact that we do not educate attention in our children is, I think, nothing short of a moral failing. And if we had kids who actually had rudders of their mind, if you will, so that they can regulate their attention, they can actually resist the kind of capture that occurs with the narratives that are often dominant in our culture, narratives of fear, for example. I think that there's a lot that can be gained, and I think most educators, parents, legislators would agree that we want our children who are good at being able to self-regulate, that this is a skill that can be trained, can be educated, and this is a skill that research actually shows quite robustly predicts life success. And so I think that if we had children, not educating attention, the metaphor is like having a sailboat that is in the middle of a turbulent ocean without a rudder. That's the nature of the situation today. And attention can provide that kind of rudder and help children to intentionally regulate their own minds, rather than having their minds hijacked by the media and the narratives which are so fear-based in our culture today.
And I think it's terrific. I think as well, as a young person, I was absolutely captivated by biographies, right? Reading people's stories. So we take the attention, but we bring it to stories that make these movements alive. So critical race theory is going to be, the provenance of academia and other intellectuals who want to make these changes, and those are absolutely necessary, but they're not sufficient, and they often get us caught up in unfortunate arguments that don't necessarily move forward for education in our school systems. So I think we've got to not just tell the story from theory, but back to your point of practice and so on. I mean, the story of Rosa Parks, the story of John Lewis, these are amazing stories. The stories of the suffragettes and standing out in front of the Wilson White House and having things thrown at them and so on, and yet they persisted. What we all want to feel and understand and sustain is action against all odds, resilience of the human spirit despite everything. And we want to get up not just angry, but somehow hopeful that change can happen and filled with gratitude that we can participate in. And that's what historical biographies give us, among many things, inspiration.
Yeah, and one thing to just point out to follow on that, one of the things I always remind myself of and others is when Martin Luther King gave his famous speech, the title was not "I Have a Nightmare."
Yeah.
And I think having a dream of a different way of being, a different narrative, is really so essential for the kind of inspiration and hope that you describe.
Yeah. And I do think Native American lifeways and cultures are now being reappreciated and understood and lifted up. There's other ways of knowing. And again, through the biography, Crazy Horse, these incredible leaders, what they endured, but how that culture is also infusing our ways of knowing. Traditional environmental knowledge, scientific knowledge, and so on. We like to think we're ninja at a place like Yale, which is so bureaucratic and so on. But if you find those openings, I think we can make this happen over time. Midwife it.
I'd like to also circle back to Rashad's original question. Rashad, I have a tactical suggestion for you. You want to know what can you do in a situation where something like critical race theory is under such attack? And the advice comes from martial arts, from Aikido. If you attack an Aikido master, he'll move. Where you're putting all your energy of attack isn't going to do a thing because he's not there anymore. He's doing something else. And that something else in a school setting could be something that Richie alluded to, which is skill building, which is teaching procedural knowledge. There's not just honing attention and concentration ability. There's another exercise for attention called expanding the circle of caring, which I think is very relevant to the bias question, because as you expand the circle of people you actually care about, and you see that everyone should be cared about, it's in effect teaching kids, there's no room for bias in this. Just a thought.
Well, I'm really interested in, Mary Evelyn, you talked about this, this sort of sometimes amorphous American dream idea, but also it's an atomizing narrative, isn't it? It's an individualizing narrative. It's a rugged individualism narrative. It's a take and conquer narrative. How do we, and Daniel, how do we hold these things of this very powerful narrative? Someone said someone once said Americans are a group of temporarily embarrassed millionaires, right? It's like we're all sort of going to be the next Elon Musk, I suppose. But it makes me, how do we imbue some of this more collective ideas, this collective narrative in spaces and places where we're very much rewarded for a sense of individualism, and it's incentivized?
One thing that's really interesting to me, and Rashad, you do a lot of work in organizations, is that many, many organizations are now looking beyond the individual. You know, you could be narcissistic. You could be a leader who only cares about yourself. What organizations are saying is, you know, we need people who care about the team level, who care about the group, who care about, for example, that sense of belonging. And I think valuing that is really important. MIT, for example, is now teaching its kids, its students rather, not to be just about themselves when they enter a company, but to think about the common good, the greater good. What is it that they're becoming part of, and what kind of team are they becoming part of? I think we need a narrative that's more along those lines.
Yeah, and just to amplify on that, we have developed a curriculum that we call the kindness curriculum for preschool children. And it is a curriculum that combines both declarative and procedural learning and really emphasizes the procedural part. It's been tested scientifically. There's publications, randomized controlled trials showing the benefit. But one of the really interesting observations that we've made is that at least in American classrooms, the kindness curriculum actually doesn't make the kids more kind over the course of the school year, but it prevents the kids from becoming more selfish. And it turns out that the average American child starts out preschool showing spontaneous high levels of kindness. And those spontaneous high levels of kindness diminish over the course of the preschool period. And so this is, I think, a reflection of the cultural narrative that you're describing, Rashad. But we can counter it with these simple educational programs and strengthen what is really an innate quality, which is kindness. And so it doesn't take much, but we need to be proactive because I think the very future of humanity as we know it depends upon it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I like to say there's no future without a shared future. That's where we are as almost 8 billion people. And it doesn't take a lot to say, if you break your wrists, you can't solve that yourself. And you know, the kindness that I had at Yale New Haven Hospital, and people everywhere, that instinct that Richie said over and over again is absolutely there. People pushing me through the airport in the wheelchair. But what I want to say is our society, this is where I'm saying life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. You know, the hyper-individualism, my way or the highway, that has led to massive guns across the country, the rights of the individual, not the rights of the collective, not the rights of nature, not the rights of future generations. That has all been blown out of the water. Europe has a far greater sense of this. But what was so powerful to me in going to Japan in the early 70s, actually, was seeing a society that actually has these reciprocities, has these ways of relating to people, has elements of cultivation from Confucianism and other traditions that says you cultivate yourself not for personal salvation or for even enlightenment. You cultivate yourself for the common good. That's what Confucianism is about. And that tradition has affected more people on the planet than any other tradition because of its antiquity, 6,000 years, because of numbers of people. And so what I like to say is we need healthy individualism. We need creativity. People love entrepreneurship and creativity here. That's fantastic. And creativity in the arts. People come to New York and San Francisco, LA for that creativity. But we also need to cultivate commonalities in the plural, a sense of a shared city, society, and so on. When I taught Confucianism for many years, I would say, you cannot play sports, team sports, without a team. And that's part of, it's in our society. We have to lift up examples which make it clear that team making leads to exciting interactions and so on. So the common good as well as healthy individuals, it's a new yin-yang, it's a new synergy. And that's why we need other cultures to infuse our way forward, for sure.
And even in practices that can be done individually or collectively, for example, if a person is engaged in physical exercise to help themselves become more healthy, a simple shift in mindset where they can invoke the intention that I'm becoming more healthy, getting myself in shape, not just for myself, but so that I can be of benefit to my family. I can be of benefit to the people I work with. I can be of benefit to my community. That simple shift in mindset can produce enormous beneficial consequences that we've measured scientifically just with this simple mindset shift. And so it again, it doesn't take much if we remind people about this different mode of being, this different narrative. We can, I think, really see and taste the benefits very, very quickly.
And I want to say, generosity, compassion, American society has it to be evoked even more. We understand philanthropy, and Louisville's a huge example, but the philanthropic mindset in this country, when a disaster happens, people are there. The floods in Kentucky, et cetera, the Ian, the hurricane. People do want to help. How that is evoked with a sense of compassion, reciprocity, generosity, it's a yet fully untapped potential. And that's part of the reversal. We want to be helpful to people, especially those in need.
And I think that kind of stuff which you're drawing attention to is absolutely true, and it's happening all the time. And we simply need to take the time and notice that it's actually happening.
Yeah, I mean, I say it because I was part of a project on philanthropy out of the University of Indiana. They asked me to write about Confucianism. Well, Confucianism relies on the state to take care of everything. But we have a private sector. We have this creative energy that can be pulled forward. That's all I'm saying. And we have great examples of doing it. So Asian societies are coming here to learn how to do philanthropy, you see, because it's not built into their DNA like it is here.
I think there's, as a reformed journalist, I have to make a confession, which is that what makes headlines is what's upsetting to people. If you actually looked at all of the acts of kindness and compassion and caring that occur every day, the small acts among families, among friends and communities, and you put that on one side of a scale, and then you put the things that make headlines, the horrible stuff on the other, the acts of goodness would far outweigh the acts of badness. Just something that we need to correct, I think, in the narratives that we hear and tell each other.
And Yes Magazine out of Seattle does that. They give the positive stories. And there are other news outlets for that. We need that, Dan.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if we can continue on this idea of interdependence as a vehicle for some of the social outcomes that we're seeking. And, how can we continue to leverage this idea of connection, of necessary connection, as a method for justice? And so, we talk about natural disasters often. Here in Kentucky, we had recently tornadoes, we had floods in eastern Kentucky. There was a lot of outpouring of compassion and help for our neighbors in eastern Kentucky. Certainly, you mentioned the murder of Breonna Taylor. There was a major civil rights mobilization across the state. And yet, in Louisville, certainly we have a police department that harasses and oppresses Black and brown communities every day. Certainly in eastern Kentucky, they're dealing with toxic groundwater and the horrors of mountaintop removal generationally. And so in what ways, what are our opportunities to think about that the nature of interdependence in ways that collectively we can say the daily injustices happening in our city are not okay. The daily injustices, the generational injustices happening in our city are not okay. They're not okay in Eastern Kentucky. And in what ways can that connection between people across a state like ours, how can we leverage that to push for real justice, real economic justice, real environmental justice? What are our opportunities?
Well, I would, I think those are all, extremely important challenges, and I don't really think any of us have the answers. But I do think that the very same mechanisms that result in us not paying attention to the good things that Dan was describing, the many acts of kindness that are replete in most people's everyday life, those same mechanisms are at play in us being blind to the kinds of issues that you're talking about also, Rashid. And so I think that we need a kind of awakening of awareness so that the aperture of awareness can be much more expanded, and we can actually pay attention to and be bothered by, allow ourselves to be bothered by these injustices that you're describing. Our attention can be so pulled and we're so distracted. We talk about a fiscal deficit in this country. In my view, the attention deficit in this country far exceeds the fiscal deficit. Yet there are ways, I think, to help this. And I think that we really do need to focus a lot on this next generation, who I think we really can educate in a different way and will be a voice for a very different narrative.
Dan, do you have?
So I think that the interconnection, I think that the social injustice and the environmental crisis are actually interwoven. If you look at, for example, the cost of pollution of toxic chemicals, far more impacts people of color, for example. And so by correcting or facing or making transparent and acting on setting it right for the environment, I think we also would have to speak to the built-in social injustice that goes hand in hand.
Yeah, I think you are asking one of the key questions across the country, right? How do we bring different ethnic groups together, different causes together? And I do think what Dan just said and Richie in his own wonderful way, I think the social justice and environmental justice is the key weaver. And that's what we're seeing at Yale. This fall, there were 2 huge conferences on environmental justice. One was African American and African justice, bringing Ken Saro-Wiwa's daughter from the Delta in Nigeria, where he, 25 years ago, was hanged because of his protests against Shell and so on. You've got environmental leaders in the Amazon, indigenous people who the human rights are being abused all the time. That is being brought into focus and so on. We've helped at Trinity, my college in Washington, environmental justice program, because the whole school now is educating inner city African American and Latina women. And it's powerful, and people are really supporting that. And I think there's one example that brings this together in a way that was very hopeful, even though the outcome wasn't, and that's the Standing Rock event in North Dakota with Hunkpapa Sioux, it came from the youth of their tribe to say, we are going to have a fire, we are going to make this a sense of sacredness of land and water. They had runners all the way to Washington, D.C. of the youth group. But that gathering that, as you know, expanded across to be the largest gathering of indigenous peoples in modern history from Latin America and so on, but also African Americans came out there. Cornel West was out there saying, we have solidarity of our African American communities with you protesting the sacredness of water and the pipeline going under the Missouri River. We had such solidarity. Veterans came, and veterans were asking for forgiveness and so on in this context. So we are going to be creating solidarities, rituals of forgiveness, new beginnings, and that example, I think, will be a great inspiration going forward of Standing Rock, of those new alliances that we're drawing together.
So I got carried away, and I realized we are over time. So let me thank each of you for your time tonight. Daniel, Richie, Mary Evelyn, thank you so much. It was an honor sharing space with you. Thank you.